Hello, and welcome to the Intro to Houdini course. For the next few lessons, we're going to be looking at some techniques for working with characters in Houdini. This lesson is going to be about the hair and fur system, and it's going to be in two parts. So before we dive straight into making a full head of hair, for part one, we're going to practice on something simple. There's a lot of tools that you're about to find out for grooming and controlling the look of the hair in Houdini. So I think it's best if we get used to how they perform on a sphere first before jumping to a human head, because human head's going to be a lot more complicated, and then, if we mess up or are unfamiliar with the controls and have to go back, it's going to be really sad because it takes a lot of time. So we won't be worried about messing up on a sphere, and if we do mess up, we can always just delete it and try again. And in part two, we're going to be actually taking a 3D model of a female head and we're going to be adding hair to it. So we're going to be looking at a lot more grooming techniques and hair setup for part two. So for part one, all we really need is a sphere to add some hair to it. So let's do that. In the create shelf, we're just going to drop in a sphere. And we could add hair to the whole sphere, but I think if we're going, if our final goal here is to be able to do something similar to what we would find on a character, like a human head, we're going to want to add fur maybe just to the top part of the sphere so that it sort of mimics the way that the hair is laid out on a person. So we want to just go into the geometry level so we can maybe just select the top half or so of the faces. Make sure that you don't have select visible geometry only on, otherwise, when you do this, you're only going to get half of what you want. So make sure that's unchecked. Grab top 4 or 5 or so rows of faces, and then we're going to go into the hair shelf and click on Add Fur. And we'll have to give it a minute because it's got a lot of calculations in a really big network to complete. So there we go. Our hair has been added to our sphere. And let's get started and take a look at the plethora of options that we have to control how this looks. So if we deselect the hair, first off, like the immediate thing is we've got two colors of hair here. We've got these black hairs, and then we've got these more sparse, sort of pale yellow colored hairs. Um, the black hairs are the normal hair representation that we have in Houdini, and the yellow hairs are something called guide curves or guide hairs. The guide hairs exist to make the hair calculations go a lot faster. So instead of having Houdini simulate on every single hair, which, on the low end is going to be in the tens of thousands, and on the high end it's going to be in the millions, that would take a really long time to simulate. So instead, we just simulate on these guide hairs. So I can actually turn off the display. I'm toggling the display on and off right now between the visible hairs and the guide hairs. You can see there's very few guide hairs in comparison to the overall number of hairs. So what Houdini does is it just simulates on these guide hairs, and when we do our grooming and stuff, we're affecting the guide hairs. That way, it only needs to calculate on a small percentage of the actual hair, and then the normal hairs around the guide hairs sort of borrow their look and behavior from the guide hairs. And when we have a bunch of hairs, it looks totally natural. You don't know that we're just simulating on a low percentage of hairs. And this is a pretty common way of doing it in almost every 3D software. So the first thing that I want to look at is the various hair properties that we have before moving on to actually starting to groom. So if you see in the scene view in our node graph down here, it's added this fur object, and when we have the fur object selected, you can see that we've got a bunch of options here. We've got a tab for the basic hair, and then we've got guide curves, and we've got all kinds of other tabs. So we're gonna go over most of these settings right now so that we, know how to change the settings and the look of the hair. So the first important and most self-explanatory parameter is the hair length. So you can click and drag and it's going to make the hair grow longer and shorter. So if we just drag it out, the hair gets longer. That's kind of big for now. Maybe like 0.3 is okay. So the next parameter that we have is hair segments, and this is also another very standard thing in a lot of hair and fur packages. So the hair isn't just made up of one fluid, piece of hair like it is in real life. Instead, it's made up of a number of line segments. So the higher this number is, the better the hair is going to look when it bends and moves. However, as you could probably guess, it's also going to increase the simulation time. So for now, we're going to leave it at the default value, and we could always go back and increase this later. The distribution seed. So this lets you specify the seed in the random number generator that Houdini uses to place the hairs. Basically, what that means is Houdini randomly just sort of puts these hairs all over the surface of the geometry that we selected, and it does it randomly, but it does it randomly in the same way every single time. So if we don't like the way that it's laid out, we can give the random number generator something called a seed, which sort of offsets the way it does its calculation. It doesn't change the overall look. I mean, if you scroll through the different seeds, you can see that pretty much our hair looks the same. The only thing that's changed is, where the individual strands of hair have been placed. So maybe if you're happy with the overall look of your hair, but aren't happy with the way maybe a couple of noticeable hairs are maybe in the wrong spot, or they're sticking out in some weird fashion, uh, maybe if you change this distribution seed, you'll get a look that you want. Next, we have the display density. And so by default, this display density and this render density, they're linked together, meaning if you change one, the other changes with it. It's chosen this default value right now of, almost 71,500 uh, for the density. So if we scrub back and forth on it, you can see the display density and the render density always match up here. Um, I'm going to lower it from its normal value. It was, a little over 70,000. I'm going to change it down to about 10,000. Just so that, uh, you know, yeah, I've mentioned this in the past before. Getting interactive performance in the viewport is very important. And when you're also doing a video recording on top of that, uh, it can get a little taxing on the system. So I tend to like to keep my values pretty low because sitting and waiting for things to simulate, uh, well, it's quite frankly very frustrating to work with, and also kind of frustrating to watch from your end as well. So if your computer can handle it, by all means, keep the display density up as high as you can go without chugging down the system. 10,000 seemed to work well when I was testing this out before, so we're going to keep it at that number. The display ratio, which is underneath the display density, this is how many hairs we're actually seeing in the viewport, right? So we have a display density of 10,000, but we're actually only seeing 5% of that right now. This is, again, so that we can still get that interactive performance because, rendering hundreds of thousands of hairs gets extremely taxing. Um, right, you can see we can crank this display ratio up. It gets thicker, but you can probably feel on your end the slider starts getting bogged down quite a bit. So I'm going to leave this at its default value of 0.5 for now, and I can always increase it again later. It is important to note that changing this display ratio is not actually going to affect the way that the final image gets rendered out. So, for instance, if we just jump over into our render view really quickly and tell it to start rendering, Um, it'll probably take a minute. The hair can sometimes render quite slowly. So we can see what we're getting here, and I'll just pause it. Um, this is what it looks like when we have, rendering out with a zero point 0.5 display ratio. And if I crank it up to like a 1 display ratio and then restart the render, it's not going to look any different. So the display ratio is only going to affect what we see in the viewport. And that's pretty nice because that means if we, want to render with this higher density, but we don't necessarily, um, we can't necessarily run the full density in the viewport. We don't have to keep changing it back and forth, the actual density number every single time. We can just change the ratio number. So for now, keep it at 5%. The render density, however, that works pretty much exactly the same as the display density, right? Except it's going to be in the final render. Again, these two things are linked, so right now you don't even have to worry about changing them both. You can just change one. Like if we change the display density, to twice as high, so 20,000, and then we go back into the render view, we're going to get a lot denser hair, right? It's going to be actually twice as thick as it was before. And then the final parameter, the render ratio, works exactly the same as the display ratio, except obviously you only notice it in the final rendered image. So this default value of 1 renders all of the hairs. If you're tweaking your hair settings, like if you're tweaking the lighting and you're tweaking the material, and you want to do some like iterative renders to dial in the settings, you might want to scale this value back a little bit just so you don't have to render every hair every time. You can get a bit quicker render times, right? Like if we lower it to 0.3, you can still see we've got the same color of hair and it looks the same. It's just, a lot thinner hair, but it's also rendering a lot faster. So you can crank this render ratio down if you wanna iterate quickly on your renders, and then when you're ready to do the final render, you can crank it back up to 1 and get your full rendered head of hair. So that's pretty much all the settings here that are important for now anyways on the basic hair settings. Let's go look at the guide curves. These guide hairs, again, they're the hairs that are controlling the overall look of the hair simulation. And then the other hairs, that we see are just borrowing their properties from the neighboring guide hairs. So let's look at these properties. These first 3 checkboxes, you're probably going to want to leave on most of the time. So like if use guides is not on, then we're not going to get to use any of this guide hair functionality, obviously. If the display is turned off, the guide hairs will still function. We just won't be able to see them here in the viewport. And that could be useful, once you've figured out if you've got your hair groomed and in place and you're not going to be editing the character's hair anymore. We can turn the guide hairs off because we won't need those. But for now we're just starting out with our hair. We're gonna want to edit these settings, so we're gonna want to keep the display on. And then the final checkbox up here at the top says that we're gonna remove all unguided hairs. So these guide hairs have like an effective radius around them, right? Like if we zoom in really close, like you can see there's a lot of hairs that are in between each guide hair, and each guide hair is going to look out in a certain radius around it. And in fact, that's this influence radius down here. At least when we're in these current settings, it is. So if there are any hairs that are outside of this influence radius from the guide hairs, they'll actually get deleted, which might not sound great to actually have this delete your hairs, but when you think about it, it's really what you want to do because if we have thousands of randomly placed hairs, um, we're bound to have a couple hairs that just very slightly miss that radius of influence, And therefore, when we start combing our hair and grooming it and adding curls and whatnot, it's going to be just a couple random hairs that are sort of sticking up because they're not influenced by the guide curves. So that's why we want to keep remove unguided hairs on, at least in this case. So on to the rest of the parameters. I'll talk about guide type at the end of the rest of these. Distribution seed works the same way as the basic hair controls, right? We're just changing the way that it's scattered across the surface. Um, let's see. The next is the density. And the density does not work the same way as the basic hair controls. So this controls the actual density, right? Like when we're in the basic controls, we have our density, and then we have this ratio. So we have, um, we have more hairs than are actually being displayed when we are working with this display ratio. The guide hairs do not have any sort of ratio, so we're controlling it just with the density, meaning that if we don't see any guide hairs here, that means there is no guide hair there. So only the ones that we see are the ones that exist. And in truth, we don't really want any guide hairs that are being hidden, so having this density control the way it is right now is probably for the best. Next is the relax iteration, and it's a kind of smoothing parameter, so let me explain how that works a little bit. Because we're using this scatter on surface guide type, we get randomly placed guide curves, all along those faces that we selected. Since we want to avoid large gaps in our guide curves, we have to use this relax value, because when they're getting randomly placed over the surface, sometimes the random number generator will put two guide curves very close to each other, and then there might be large areas of gaps where no guide curves exist. And we might notice that large gap when we do our hair grooming, because there will be a clump of hair that's not really, um, being influenced by any close guide curves. So what this relax value does is that by increasing it, let me go back just so we can look at it. Um, when we increase it, it increases the number of iterations that it sort of smooths the layout of the hairs, of the guide hairs. So a value of 0 does not smooth the position at all. We just sort of get like where the random like hairs get placed. When we start turning the relax iterations up, we can see that the hair starts bending into place to sort of make it a little more equidistant from one another. So at a really, really high value, I think the hairs would, there's probably a theoretical value where all of the hairs are like exactly equidistant from each other at every single point along the curve. But a value of 10 keeps it pretty well, it keeps it pretty well separated from one another while also, having a little bit of randomness so it doesn't look too uniform. And then this influence radius, that's automatically set by default. It's actually being set by two values in the geometry view, which we can actually look at if we really want to look at the geometry view. It's really, really complicated for the fur, so this will probably be like the first time that we've ever used a shelf tool that we're not going to go in and examine every little detail, because this is quite an extensive network, and they're actually not, like, this isn't even as far as it goes. Like if we go into the render guides, like this is one of the areas where that influence radius is coming from, and there's yet another subnetwork down in here. For now, just know that this network gets created automatically when we use the add fur tool, and basically what it does is it adds the fur. It automatically calculates the skin, which is how we apply the fur onto the geometry. It creates the guide hair network, And then it adds some things we're going to look at in a minute, clumping, parting lines, and then there's also a visualization line for the parting line, which we can also look at later. Um, but yeah, so just so that you know, that's not like a magic number that's coming out of nowhere. The influence radius is automatically calculated for us when we use the add fur tool. And for now, we can just kind of trust that it's going to do a decent job at guessing a proper radius based on the way that the guide curves were distributed. So now let's go back up here because I had skipped over guide type and I just wanted to touch on what the rest of the settings do. The guide type determines like how the guide hairs are created. So by default, it's scatter on surface, and that gives us these density and relax iterations parameters. We could change it to place at every surface point, which does a kind of similar job, but I think the scatter on surface gives us a better job of laying out hairs overall just because we get that relax iteration and density parameters. And you can see when you change it to this setting, we actually don't get those anymore. So this is just kind of, we're basing our hair on the like raw input geometry. There's two more options. One of them is use external, which we would want to use this if we had made our guide curves in a different software package. So we're doing characters here, right? That's what our focus is on. So like either Maya or ZBrush are two very common programs that we would maybe be making characters in. So those are also common programs that we might be bringing in our guide curves. Since they're much more common softwares that you see for making characters. You don't often see Houdini being used for that. Not because it can't do it, but mostly because there's other tools that are, maybe more established for character design work and stuff. However, you can still take advantage of Houdini's hair system by importing the guide curves that you've created in those programs if you chose to do so. You can also do the final option, which is draw guides manually. Does what it sounds like, draw our own guide curves if we need to. For now, we'll stick with scatter on surface. At the bottom, we can control a few large-scale properties of the look of the hair. So this comb noise is going to add some directional variation when we use the comb tool. It keeps all of the hairs from going in the exact same direction. You can kind of see that when you mess with the value a little bit. The bend is going to control how much the hair bends when we comb it. Um, like if we have a bend value of 0, I just type it in. And then we comb the hair, it's gonna stay pretty much perfectly straight. Um, I can actually, I'll do that a little bit later. It'll still bend the way that we want it to when we comb it. If the bend value is at 0, it's just not gonna add any variation to the bend. So it's all gonna be very like straight and, or not straight. Straight's not the right word. Very uniform. That's probably a better word. There's not gonna be any random variation to the bend. Um, so we want to keep some values in comb, bend, and then this twist parameter as well, which rotates the hair around its base. So you can see that too. Again, that happens randomly when we groom it. All these parameters are just to make sure that all of the hair doesn't behave the exact same way. Otherwise, we're going to have a very sterile and plain look to our hair. Everything's going to look like, when we groom it, it's going to look way too uniform. All the hair, we comb it one direction, it's going to be very straight and parallel to one another. Um, and everything we do in CG, we always want to add a little bit of randomness so it doesn't look so fake. Um, and then we can also, in the attributes tab, we can add attributes, we can transfer attributes to the hair if we need to. And then with the length, we could also add in a custom painted length map as well, if we've painted one. So the next tab is hair types. It lets us add two different kinds of hair to our hair system.
which are white hairs and guard hairs. White hairs will render a percentage of the hairs as white instead of their normal color. Obviously it would be useful on characters who are aging and, have starting to develop gray hairs, but it might not be a bad idea to add a very, very small amount to, any character or animal, just to break up the texture of the hair that they have. And again, you could also control that in the material properties as well. This just gives you um, a pretty easy way of doing it. It's not going to show up, by the way, if we start increasing the ratio here, we won't actually see them as white. We will have to actually start rendering in order to see anything. So we've got about 20% of the hairs as white right now, so it should be fairly noticeable. Give it a second. There it goes. So increasing the ratio of white hairs is just going to, turn a certain percentage of the hairs as white, and don't have to render out the whole thing. We can see the white hairs popping up in there. Guard hairs. This is something that we're maybe not familiar with, unless you know something about animals, because we don't have guard hairs as people. Many animals, however, do have guard hairs, so this parameter would be useful when making animal fur. So if you have like a dog or a cat, you might notice that they've got their normal coat of fur. It's relatively thick depending on the breed, and it's shorter and closer to their body. And then they also have a second coat of fur, which are longer hairs that extend past the normal coat of fur. So these longer hairs are called guard hairs, and what they do in animals is they protect the coat of hair that's underneath. So if we start to turn this ratio up, we see that we have a second set of hairs that sticks out longer than our normal set of hairs, and they start popping up here. There's some parameters to distinguish the guard hairs from the rest of the hair down here. They're pretty self-explanatory. We're not going to cover them for time's sake. So uh, next we have the appearance tab. And actually, before we go into that, I'm just going to turn the guard hairs off. And we can turn the white hairs off too. So in the appearance tab, this is where we can control the overall look of the hair. You can see there's a lot of tabs in here: length, density, thickness, frizz, clump, parting. The first tab here is it's mostly useful when we have painted maps for a lot of these different parameters, right? You see there's like a length map, a density map, a cut map, and a displacement map. And I've mentioned painted maps a couple times now. I want to touch on it quickly. So we're not actually going to be making them in this lesson or even in part 2, but I don't want to skip talking about it just because of that, because you might need to use them, and I want you to know like when you could use them and like why you would use them. So quickly, I just want to mention what they are and when you want them. So a map in any 3D software, you may or may not be familiar with this. So if you already know this, you can just maybe skip ahead a minute or so, or just listen. So a map in any 3D software is just a 2D image, and it's applied like a texture. So instead of only controlling color, though, a map can control a number of different things. So two common examples that you're probably familiar with if you've been working with 3D for any period of time, would be like normal maps or bump maps. So a bump map is probably the most common one. It's a 2D black and white image that can give the illusion of a displaced surface on a 3D object. And a normal map is very similar. It's a 2D red, green, and blue image that alters the normal angles of surface points on a 3D object, which gives it the illusion of having a much higher detail than what the geometry would suggest. It's used a lot in real-time rendering engines like video games, just because it's a lot quicker to compute a normal map than it is to compute a lot more geometry. So these fur maps are no different than like a bump map. They're going to be, for the most part, black and white images that control different parameters that we can see. So black is going to set their values to 0, and white is going to set their values to 1. Using this, we can control the length, density, and displacement of the fur with separate maps. And it might seem like this would be a lot of work, right? To take your model and create like, I mean, even in just this menu alone, we have one, two, three, 4 different types of maps. Wouldn't it take forever to paint those? And it really can be quite a lot of work to paint a bunch of different maps. But let's take a look at something that we might need to use using Houdini's hair system. So this is a photo of a dog that I quickly found via Google search at bauhauspets.com that I think illustrates why we might want to paint some fur maps. This dog has a lot going on in its fur, so if we were going to make this in Houdini, um, we need to look at like what kind of properties this dog's fur has. So first, it's got pretty long hair overall. You can see especially, around its ears and the most of its body. Um, it's relatively long. You can see, actually that example of guard hairs that we were talking about, right? You can see those sticking out longer, and you can see also the fur that's closer to its body when you look along the edge. But if you look at its eyes and its nose, the fur around that area, it's pretty short, right, in comparison to the rest of its body. We might need a length map for that so that we can tell part of the dog fur to be longer and part of it to be much shorter. And then also we might not have many guard hairs right here in the face area because it looks like we could see it pretty well here in the profiles, but this dog was groomed, and so it's really not going to have any hairs that's sticking up much past all the other ones. So in that case, we might need a density map for the guard hairs. And then the color of the fur changes quite obviously. We have a very harsh line here, and then some more subtle variations up near the eyes, and then again near the ears. We'd want a separate color map for that. And these are just like the immediate differences that I'm picking out when I look at this dog here. So long story short, it would take ages to groom this dog's hair by hand. And painting maps would give us a much better starting point on like a really complex character like this. So I hope that adequately illustrates why we would want to use fur maps if we were making some complicated character. But let's move on to the rest of the settings because we won't be doing anything near this complicated, especially in an intro course. So the next few settings, thickness, frizz, clump, parting, these all have, quite a lot of parameters. So if I don't explicitly, I'm not going to go down the list, and explain what every single one is, because the video would just be too long, in order to cover everything. So if there's a parameter and you're confused about it, you can always click this little question mark button, and it will actually pop up and it will show you all of the options for the tool that you have selected. And if you, well, that error box pops up like half the time. I have no idea why, but it always happens when I bring this up. You can always just read what those settings do if you're confused. For the most part, they're either very self-explanatory or when you read the description, you kind of know what's going on. Of course, if you're still kind of lost, you're always free to ask in the comments section, and I can help out and reply to your comment and explain what the setting is if you're lost. So anyway, let's go on to what these control. The thickness control has a nice ramp here that you can see, where we can set the thickness of the hair as it goes from the base of the hair to the tip of the hair. You could drag this around all day and you're not going to see anything change here in the viewport. This is only going to affect what we see in the render. Frizz works similarly, right, from the base to the tip of the hair. and it controls how frizzy or wavy the individual hairs become. So we can zoom in to see a little closer. If I start to change the values, nothing actually changes, and you might be wondering why. It's because our minimum and maximum frizz are both set to 0. So if we change the maximum frizz up, you can see what that starts to do, right? It starts to make the hair a little more, frizzy and bendy. And by default, it sort of tends to frizz near like the lower sort of middle section. The base and the tip of the hair doesn't have a lot of frizzing going on, and I think if you increase them, you can kind of see why that's the case. Because then the hair just looks kind of wild, and you have a lot more natural look when there's not a whole lot of frizzing going on at the base and the tip. Clumping creates a new kind of curve. So if we turn on clumper, we get these red hairs, and these are called clump hairs. So this hair attracts all the nearby hair towards it. And you might be thinking, don't we have guide hairs to do that? We kind of do, but clumping hairs are different than guide hairs. So guide hairs propagate their overall shape and direction to nearby hairs. Clumps actually pull, they attract nearby hair towards them. So let's look at an example of that first, and then we'll try it out ourselves. So if you're taking this class, then I assume you have an interest in animated and VFX films, so I think it's safe to say that most of you have seen this movie, if not heard of it. It's Brave by Pixar, and the main character, Merida, her hair here perfectly illustrates how clumping works. You can zoom in and look at it. Her hair has a lot of distinct curls and shapes, but they aren't just random hairs that are going all over the place. Most of them are actually clumps of hair that are all taking the same basic shape, right? Like if you look at the outer edges, right, you've got this curling shape going on, but it's not just one hair, right? It's several distinct strands of hair, and that's what clumping is. So let's add clumping to our hair to see how it works. For this, we're going to go up and turn the guide hairs off, just because otherwise we might not be able to see the clumping very well. We'll go back into appearance, go into clumping, and we're not seeing anything. Wonder why that is. Oh, that was dumb. I turned use guides off. We want to turn the display off. So if we turn use guides off, we're not going to be able to see the clumping hairs. But if we turn the display off, right, the guide hairs are still there. They're just not being rendered in the viewport. So let's make sure you have clumper on and make sure the display is on so we can actually see it. And then I'll turn the density down just to better illustrate the example. And we'll turn the tightness way up, all the way to 1. And you can really clearly see what's going on. Obviously, you'd never use these settings, but I think it helps you understand how it actually functions, right? So all of the hairs nearby these red guide curves are being sort of pulled, like they're kind of attracting towards those red hairs. And so if we were actually going to be recreating Merida from Brave, we would probably, want to import some very carefully crafted guide curves from another program or create our own, like curly looking guide curves. And then we could have our hair sort of follow along that same path. We don't really need guide curves for this example, so you can turn it off or leave it on. If you want to leave it on, I would suggest, turning this tightness down. That way your hair is a little more believable. So I'm going to turn clumping off. And then parting, these just controls how the parting lines affect the hair. We can look at that in a few minutes, but basically, actually, I went to the wrong section. You can add this parting line, and it'll just sort of push push the hair away from it, and this controls how thick the parting line is and how it displays. So we're not going to control these or look at these last three controls, um, at least not right now. The dynamics just gives us some extra control over how the hair simulates. The skin, I mentioned skinning before, it's just how the hair is applied to the source geometry. It does a great job by itself right now. It set itself up when we use the add fur button. And then render is going to control how the hair looks when we render it out, and we're not going to be talking about rendering in depth. So, okay, I say that's enough going over settings because it's starting to get boring at this point. So let's actually start using the tools and learning how they work. Let's first, it's going to be important, make sure that our guide hairs are visible. And I'm also going to set the density of the guide hairs kind of low, like down to 100. That's pretty sparse. But, unfortunately, I can't really cache out hair grooming the way that I could cache out dynamics, and pause the videos. So a really low density like this is going to let me be able to sort of, interactively work with the hair at the same time as recording the video without it being too choppy. So, right, if you can keep your density higher, it's going to be expensive to calculate, but if you can do it without the Houdini starting to get all bogged down, I would suggest keeping your density as high as you can. So we're also going to increase the length of the hair, just because, well, you'll see why in a minute, because we're going to cut it. We're going to change it pretty high, like out to 1. So that'll be pretty good. So got a nice long base of hair here to start working with. So let's talk about the tools. So if you look at the first shelf, there's a lot of painting tools, right? And most of these are like all the attributes that we just looked at. So, right, you can paint the color, you can paint the thickness, you can paint density. You can even, add in those guard hairs or the white hairs. For instance, if we want to, paint Frizz, for example, we can click on the hair, hit enter, and then start, adding frizziness just to the sections that we want it there in the hair. All of these tools work kind of the same way. If you go to the brush tab, you can change the radius of the brush when you're on here, and you can also usually change the pressure and the opacity, which is it's just like the strength of what's getting applied. So you can like if we lowered the opacity, it would affect the frizziness a lot less. So we won't go too much into how to paint stuff, at least not now. And all of these options are very, very similar. And since we just looked at most of them as an overall setting rather than just painting individual ones, we're not going to go into painting individual stuff. We're actually going to look at some of this stuff later in part 2, so we don't need to cover it right now. And I think we all, at this point, have an understanding of how this all works. The grooming shelf, however, this is where we get all the really cool tools. And these let us shape the hair and sort of like cut it and comb it the way that you would actually, do with real hair in real life. So let's start by cutting the hair. Actually still in my old tool, so go back to the selection tool and make sure we're back in the object level with the hair selected, and I'm going to select the cut hair tool. Whenever you select a tool for the first time, it's going to have to calculate a little bit. All of these grooming options on the hair are kind of expensive effects, and so You'll notice a little bit of slowdown like that anytime you're about to work with it. And as you notice, our display hairs just got hidden, and all we're seeing are the guide hairs, which is great. Again, the guide hairs are the ones that are actually like, being simulated. The display hairs are just borrowing their appearance from the guide hairs. So we don't need to see the display hairs right now. We can always go back and look at them uh, when we're done grooming the guide hairs. So let's see, turn the grid on for a second. Just make sure that I'm looking at this from the front. Um, we're not going to be like super precise in how we cut this sphere's hair. Uh, Actually, going to kind of give it a mullet. Um, Not because mullets are the most attractive things ever, but mostly because it's going to let us, practice grooming different sizes of hair. So we're gonna cut it shorter on the sides and in the front, and we're gonna leave it kind of longer everywhere else. So with the cut hair tool selected, you can keep the brush the size that it is, or if you want to increase the size a little bit, you don't just have to drag this radius parameter. You could also hold down the shift key and then left mouse click in the viewport, and it will let you change the size of your brush. So I'm just going to kind of drag this. Not being like super precise. Just going to cut the hair shorter on the sides. Leave it a little longer near the top. Go to the side view. Kind of cut it short there in the front. Yeah, there we go. That'll probably be good enough. It's sticking out quite a bit right now, but we're about to fix that. So when you're satisfied with the length of the hair that you just cut, that's not really very symmetrical here. I think I'm making it worse every time I do this. You can see why I went to CG instead of beauty school. So I like the length of the hair. It's good enough for now anyways. So let's start combing it. We don't want it just sticking up like this. So if we actually have two brushes here that we can comb with. They both do really kind of the same thing. Let's start with a surface brush just to see how this works. So with the surface brush, we have, our same brush radius, and wherever we put the brush, it's going to target the mesh underneath the hair. And when we start combing, it's going to start affecting the hairs on the mesh. So it's going to use like the base of any hair that touches the base of the mesh where we start painting, right? And that can be a really nice way of grooming the hair sort of near the surface, like where the scalp is at. So I'm just going to keep clicking and dragging. Every time, I don't know if you can hear it through the microphone or not, but every time I move the cursor back to the top of the sphere, I'm clicking again, dragging it down, and then letting go. So I'm not just dragging back and forth, I'm doing several different strokes. So I'm just kind of going around, painting it downward to make sure that all of the hairs are starting to lay flat. It'll probably be easier to deal with the top of the hair once we sort of get the bottom of the, like the edges of it more flattened out and laying down. So now that we've got, that surface direction sort of under control, we can go to the screen brush, and the screen brush works in screen space, which means that if we just sort of look at the hair from the side and just kind of click and drag, we can pull all of the hair. And it's kind of slow right now, so if you want to do this a little bit faster, we can make the strength a little bit higher and maybe increase the radius a tad bit. And then we can start pulling the hair down and making it a lot more like falling into place the way that real hair would. Whoops. Accidentally combed it sideways instead of rotating the camera. There we go. As you can see, there's just a tiny bit of delay every time I'm clicking, so that would go away if we, further lowered the number of guide hairs that we have, just because Houdini has to think about, every hair that we've got in the selection whenever we click. And we don't have to get everything super perfect because there's other tools that'll help us with the fine details here. So we'll say that's close enough for the back. Again, all the stuff in the middle we'll probably have to change once we're finished with the front of the hair, because it's really hard to control it all at once. We might have to do several passes. So we can just start painting the sides down. We can go back and maybe fix the way that these hairs are up here on the top, now that we can get a hold of them. Just make sure they're laying down flat. And then maybe one more pass here near the front, just to make sure that nothing's sticking out on the side, like near where the ears would be if the sphere had ears. Just a few more tweaks. This is really important to keep rotating your camera around, because since we're kind of doing this in a very like 2D space when we're using the screen brush, it'll look great at the angle that you're at, and then as soon as you adjust the angle, you realize, oh well, it's only going one direction the way that I want it to. So just make sure that you keep checking. Then we'll sort of comb this back. Okay, that's pretty good. Now we can go back to like the cut tool, because I noticed that there's some really long strands of hair here in the front. And if this sphere had eyes, it wouldn't be able to see anything. So there we go. We'll trim its bangs a little. Okay, cool. So now that we have the hair combed and trimmed up a little, maybe cut this one. We can go back to the object level and see how it looks. Make sure to click on the fur object that was created, and then turn the display hair on. Oh, and it's super frizzy in the front from when we painted the frizz. We could change that if we wanted to, but it's actually kind of funny. So yeah, we can get a better idea now of how the hair is actually going to look, and we could actually crank up the display ratio a little bit here. If you notice, there's kind of some balding going on here near the top, and that's just kind of a byproduct of how we were combing the hair. When you keep combing down and down and down and down, some of these guide curves are bound to sort of start like penetrating the top of the geometry. So if you wanted to fix that, we could select the hair and go into lift hair. And in the lift tool, turn the lift up a little bit, and this works really the same way as the brush did for the for like the screen brush and the surface brush. We can just kind of click on the hair and start dragging up, and it will pull the hairs maybe, oh, the strength is pretty darn low. We won't be able to see it very much. Let's make it really high. There we go. So this will just kind of do what the tool implies, right? It'll lift the hair up. And this will keep it from like we pushed it into the scalp maybe a little bit when we were combing. This will help us just kind of push it back out. Use it sparingly because you're going to create, stuff like this on the edges, which you're going to have to further go back and comb. And that's why I would recommend using the surface brush and the screen brush at the same time. Because if you just use the screen brush, in order to get the hair laying down flat, oops, I again meant to move the camera and instead used the lift tool. Instead of getting the hairs to lay down flat near the base with the surface brush, right, it was pretty easy to do that. If you just do it with a screen brush, you're probably going to get a lot of penetration between the hair and the mesh. So just make sure to use surface brush, then screen brush to control like the outer edges of the hair. And that way you won't have to use the lift tool as much to kind of remove these balding spots. So go back into the cut hair tool, lower the radius, just kind of trim off some of these hairs. Sort of lifted the back of this too. Right, I'm just playing at this point. Oh, if your radius is too small, you may have to move back and forth a little bit to make sure that you actually grab the hair. So we'll do one more. Oh, you can also use this length adjust too. I didn't mention that, but if we've cut the hair too short, we can always, oops, I left the target length too low. Let's see, the hair at the beginning was 1, so maybe if we cut the hair too short and we kind of wanted to bring some of the length back, we could paint the length adjustment and then make the hairs appear again as long as we want them to be. So the last thing that I want to talk about here is the smooth hair tool. I mentioned that we have some of these random hairs sort of sticking up, especially near the top. The smooth hair tool can help us take care of that. So if we just click and drag and start smoothing the hair, it'll do exactly what it sounds like it's supposed to do. And it'll make all of the hair, sort of start averaging out, which if you've done a good job of grooming your hair and making sure that most of it is all going in, a nice flowing pattern like it should be, then these little hairs that are sort of sticking up on their own are going to assimilate and look a lot more like the surrounding ones. So we could go through here and paint a lot of smoothness, and it'll help the hair look a little more like it was actually combed rather than looking real crazy like it is now. And it's just a spear, so so keep practicing with it however you want. Oh, still have the lift on. Just keep playing around with it as long as you want, because it's a really good way to get to learn the tools. Oh, I forgot to mention part hair. Said I would mention that, and then I almost went over it. So the part tool, let's turn the strength up. It's actually going to push hair away from it, and so we can sort of add a parting to our hair. Let's just start clicking and dragging upwards here, and then down a few times. So all of the hairs that kind of came into contact with the radius of this brush were repulsed by it. And now you can see we've got this sort of spot in the geometry where everything to the left of it's sort of pushing to the left, everything to the right of it's sort of pushing to the right. Um, and it kind of pushed it up a little bit, so we can put our screen brush back on and sort of groom it into place. Make sure that you're grooming the left side kind of to the left, and then the right side's kind of going to the right. If your lift is still on, it's going to pick the hair up, and that's going to be a little counterproductive. Um, so if you don't paint the hair on the left to the left and the hair on the right to the right, you're gonna kind of undo the part that you just made. So be mindful of that. If you just went straight to the side again and started combing it like that first, you're probably gonna lose some of the detail that you just painted back in. So there we go. I'll stop painting with it for now because I think that'll illustrate fairly well. Let's go back into the object level, turn the display back on. So I'm really not happy with the way we have all this frizz in here because we just went through all the trouble of grooming our hair and painting that parting line and whatnot. And the frizz is so high that we're probably gonna lose all that detail when we render. And what was the point of doing all that if we're not gonna be able to see it? So let's go take the frizz like way down. So just so we can see it. It was at a really high number as it was. So go back into the appearance tab, go into the frizz tab, and we're gonna change the maximum frizz like way down, like 0.05. That way we've got pretty much just straight hair. And then now let's go ahead and take a render of this just to see what it looks like. So again, we haven't set up any lights or even really messed with the material properties of the hair at all. So our renders aren't, you know, they're not going to look super nice. They're just sort of intended to give us a better idea of what the final effect is going to look like. So you can start to see where we've painted this parting line. It's a little more balding there, and the hair is sort of flowing, a little bit away from it. We could probably go in there and paint it a little bit stronger, especially near the top, which I think is an area I neglected because the top hairs are sort of covering up where this part is at. Um, so, so yeah, let's actually just go back and do that real quick. It'll be the last thing we do in part one. So yeah, so if we take a look at it before we go back into paint, we can see we've got a lot of hairs going in that part direction, but we also just have a lot of hairs that aren't. Um, so we're kind of losing the effect here. Let's have our first selected, and we'll go back into the grooming, and we will go back to the parting tool. So let's make this part a little more noticeable. Let's especially paint it from up higher. Maybe we could even increase the radius of the brush. This will be like ridiculous, uh, but it'll let us see. It'll let us see very clearly that we've got a part going on in the hair. And we won't even bother going in and combing the edges again because that's just, we've done that a bunch. And we know how to do it by now. So okay, we've got a pretty big part going here. We will go into the surface brush and just make sure that none of these hairs are like bending inward. Hey, there we go. Oops, I think I had the surface brush. I wanted to actually select the screen brush. There we go. Just make sure everything's curving the way it needs to go. Let's take a look at our part now. Sorry, one more brush stroke. Okay. Back to the object level. Can turn our display hairs on. We have a much more obvious part now. This should show up a lot better when we render. Let's give this a shot. Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a quite strong effect. Probably went a little too strong with it near the base, but yeah, we knew that would be happening. So yeah, there you have it. That's actually all we're gonna cover for part one. I know that was like a lot of information and a lot of tools to cover, but hopefully, hopefully it's given you the foundation and the understanding of how the hair system works and the different tools and appearance settings that you have at your disposal. That way, when we move on to part two of the lesson, you've got a stronger grasp on how to actually shape the hair, and then we can focus more on the techniques and the way of getting the hair to look and appear the way we want it to do, rather than just learning the tools from the get-go. So that'll be it for this lesson, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.